Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America. This series explores the enduring presence of racism and the psychoanalytic mechanisms that sustain it, drawing inspiration from key works and current research. Hosts Dr. Karen Messina and Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams explore the complexities of racism through the lens of psychoanalysis as they foster a crucial dialogue on racial inequality. Here are your hosts.
Welcome to Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Racism in America, a special series of the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Karen Messina, your host, along with my co-host, with whom we have great conversations, Dr. Felecia Powell-Williams. This is a series where we discuss how the tools and concepts of psychoanalysis might help us understand the persistence and dynamics of racism in the United States. We'll be talking with psychoanalysts and particularly Black psychoanalysts about how to comprehend and combat racism. I hope you enjoy the series and I hope we all learn something from it. Today, we are going to talk about two topics that highlight the theme of our program, When People Can't Listen. They include events that occurred at the annual meeting of the American Psychoanalytic Association that was held in San Francisco this February, and the halftime show at Super Bowl 59. Felecia, why don't you tell us a little bit about the meeting in San Francisco, since I wasn't able to attend this year?
Well, we missed you. But, I left the meeting with just a multitude of thoughts and feelings, and really thinking about a reunification of our organization, so to speak, that a reunification among the members, that there was something that we were beginning to hear from each other, and that we were beginning to make a space to really tolerate what each of us held, instead of resisting that and only staying in this one mind system that our way of thinking was the only way. But now I noticed that there was something else that was beginning to brew. And it brought forth a more hopefulness for us, at least for me. But there was also a moment as I sat on the Holmes Commission's panel as a guest panelist that I listened to a rendition of Sam Cooke's song. And as I listened to this song, it's been a long time coming. I was struck in so many ways. It just resonated with me. And it may have had a different meaning for that panel, but for me, having it to be so connected to my family history and how we began to explore where we were and where we are now, it just sat very, very powerful within my own spirit. And so there was something about that and how I began to take in the lyrics, how I began to hold just the melody, but to hear Sam Cooke's voice bringing forth his hopelessness, but then still a hopefulness. So there were these two entities, and how they began to come together was so important, that we do find ourselves in these places, subjectively, objectively, however that may be in the analytic dyad, that we're there and we're hearing and they're sharing with us these parts of themselves. And then for us to be able to hold that and be there with them, I felt as if I was going through that experience so much so, and was so appreciative of that being a part of the panel. So though there's a much more work for us to do within the organization, we also were able to think about how much work there is to do within our own psychoanalytic communities. But there's something, I think, about music, about the lyrics to music, various songs, that I think is really important, and where we're going today within our topic of, looking at even Super Bowl. Somebody may say, well, how does Super Bowl have anything to do with psychoanalysis? Well, I think we're about to find out a little bit more today.
Oh, absolutely. To go back to Sam Cooke's song, I can't know it the way you know it because you grew up with it. But I've heard it a number of times over the years, and I find it to be very powerful. Now, when I listen to it, or I listen to the words or read the words, I find it to be very powerful, as I always have. But I also find it to be very sad because it seems like in some ways we've come full circle. And we've got a long way to go in our country still. We've made progress. There have been peaks and valleys, but there's such a divide in our country at various levels.
We feel that divide as you're describing it. And in our offices with our patients, we feel that come through. And again, us being able as analysts to hold that, because there is a sadness and an uncertainty of what do we do with this. And the song, it brings us this idea. It's been a long time coming, but I know there's a change that's going to come.
Yes.
And so we're there, as much as this last month or so has been this long time, there's that, and the hopelessness that at some point there's a hopefulness on the other end. So I definitely agree with you about the sadness, but an anticipation for more.
Well, let's move on to getting right into Kendrick Lamar's performance.
I should have worn my NFL shirt today.
That would have been a good idea. Too bad we didn't. I want to start out by saying that people did not have to like Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl show. This isn't about whether you liked it or whether you didn't like it. It was a testament to artistry, social commentary, and star power. And what I believe he was trying to convey were messages about race, identity, and American culture. But this, again, is not about liking it. A person did not have to like it to get something out of it. Many people, I think, didn't listen and dismissed it because they couldn't understand it. So we're going to talk about defense mechanisms that might have led to not understanding because one wouldn't listen. There's a point to be made for that. But again, it's not about liking it or not liking it. It's about attempting to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was very, very powerful when Samuel Jackson, dressed as Uncle Sam, introduced Lamar to the stage and kept coming around again and again, saying that his music was too loud, too reckless, too ghetto. I think that served as a metaphor between artistic expression and societal control. What do you think about that?
I agree with you on that end. I also thought about it being a conversation between the artist, so to speak, and the country. Here we have Uncle Sam, representing, our country. We see that stamped all over the place, Uncle Sam, many years ago. but it was like a conversation, just much of what you're talking about right now. It's too loud. It doesn't fit. It doesn't belong. And so you have a reply back from the artist, from Kendrick, who is like, well, here it is. So how do we begin to accept these differences instead of divide? And so, yes, it was really powerful to have it open up with Samuel L. Jackson, holding that position.
Right. I also personally was pleased to see that women played a significant role. There's a joining of Lamar for, I believe it was Luther and All the Stars. And then Serena Williams' cameo appearance was also, I thought, very right on target. So I liked that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Jay-Z's involvement with Rock Nation and how this relates or has anything to do with Super Bowl halftime performance?
Before I get to Jay-Z, I was just thinking about something in regards to women being involved in the performance too, and how the entertainer SZA, she was there and she performed this duet that she's been doing with Kendrick, this song that they have out that you commented on. And I think that there was really a powerful move to include, because you're bringing together, not only looking at Black American culture and Black American music, and how oftentimes it has been somewhat of America resisting, and especially during a time right now where there's questions about what we can say and what we can listen to, where there's some type of feeling as if we have to be so careful. But can we allow all genres of music to be useful in how we begin to think and experience what we hold? And so oftentimes I notice that when we're working, where there is this part that comes into the office where a patient may say, well, what is psychoanalysis? What are we going to do? What is a psychodynamic approach? And so there's all of these different parts to how we can be with our patient and our patient can be with us. And we do begin to hold something together to where they begin to explore, and we can, hear where they are and they could hear where we are. And I think that this performance had a lot to do with looking at both entities and being together with that, and how so many Americans were somewhat confused about, well, what is he saying? I don't understand the lyrics, but can we be together with that? Does it have to be all this way or that way? Does it have to be split off? And oftentimes that's what tends to happen. But again, when you have SZA there and you're bringing together these two pieces, and then of course there were many thoughts about having Serena Williams there.
Right.
And how she brought forth a part of her own experience. And she wanted that to be expressed. And whether it was understood or not, she had something that she wanted to express. And does it have to be understood? But can it just be there in the space to just explore? Because we may not agree, but we can explore it and see where it leads us. Now, in regards to Jay-Z, I thought about that, and I'm glad you're asking that question, because I took some notes about Jay-Z and Rock Nation, and I really learned a lot, because I wasn't sure about his presence. I thought, oh, well, he's just really enjoying the game with his daughters. But there's more to that. And what I did discover, as I have noted here, is that he's really involved. Rock Nation is really involved in these Super Bowl halftimes. And in 2019, Jay-Z, he entered a partnership with the NFL. And so Rock Nation is now a part of providing that live music entertainment component for those games. And in this collaboration, he's become a really significant influence in even identifying particular artists. Now, as he shapes the halftime for us, and we've seen this over the last few years, since the pandemic, we've had a lot of wonderful things happen and a lot of messages, musical messages that have come through. But also, I think the important piece here is, some view the partnership as a controversial one. And given that the NFL's past handling of racial injustice, I could just say racial justice issues, particularly with Colin Kaepernick's protests, I think there was something about that, where it does become very controversial. And then to blend in Kendrick Lamar's performance, who we know, those of us who are familiar with him, know that his artistry has many threads of controversy, but many threads of let's stop and think, what is he sharing here? What is the message? And it had left us not so much about, okay, did I understand the lyrics, but what was the message? And how did it bring these two parts, those who understood, those who didn't understand the lyrics, but brought them together to begin to think about what's happening in the process. And after the performance, there were so many media segments where it was talking about those who understood, those who didn't, and how they tried to help each other to sit with what was happening. I thought was really amazing, that they could show that. They could show that there was a dyad that had truly been formed from this performance, but not everybody was willing to be a part of it.
That's very important, and it's a great lead in to what we as psychoanalysts have to offer, which is trying to understand mechanisms of defense. So, and that's a big part about our show and what we're trying to convey, how important mechanisms of defense are. And it's important to try to understand the concepts of what they represent, what they are, and how they affect all of us at different times. One striking defense when it comes to this halftime show, I think, is denial. And denial comes into play when something is too powerful, too difficult to tolerate, no matter what it has to do with. And, people can say, oh, I just didn't like it. I didn't understand. Well, it's not that they're consciously, and some people are consciously just throwing something aside. But sometimes when people don't understand something, when they can't listen, it's because it's too painful. It's too problematic. It's too hurtful. So they just push it aside and act like that's not for me. It's partly because it's hurtful, it's painful. So rather than enter into the arena and try to understand, they just kind of push it aside. So that's one thing that happens with denial, and it's this process. When it's a conscious process, and I'm not particularly referring to this, I have referred to it as blame shifting, where it's always someone else's fault. But that's something done with intention. This is something else. Denial is not dealing with something because it's too difficult. Another thing is rationalization. Just say, that wasn't important. That was just a publicity stunt. Yeah, that Lamar was just trying to generate controversy, for example. One person I read said something I thought, and I'm going to read it. I thought it was spot on. It appears as though, this person said, and this was in or from NewJersey.com, or that's where it appeared. It appears as though Drake became a proxy for all those who, without hesitation, denigrate what they can't quite fully grasp. And the song became an anthem of sorts for those of us willing to get loud and ghetto if it means fighting back against the stripping away of our rights, if it means fighting back against those who claim not to see color, but who are hell-bent on turning back the clock in our nation at a time in which Black and brown people were legally oppressed. And I think that things are happening in our country today where many of these things apply. So maybe we can talk about some other defense mechanisms, Felecia.
I'm thinking about intellectualization, but you just said something, and it took me back to the performance. And we mentioned this a little bit earlier, that the performers with Kendrick, the dancers, they formed an American flag, and he was right there in the center. And what I thought about, that we can't deny America is not this nice, neat state or United States of America, to where everything just fits so beautiful. And he was right there in the center, reminding us that there is some difference, and differences in the way in which I took it, that we must begin to understand. And I keep using the word understand, and I'm not quite sure if that's the right word that I need to continue to hold on to, because perhaps it's not so much about understanding as much as it is about, in that moment, making a space for us to begin to really tolerate the difference or differences, and in that tolerance, just be able to listen to each other. Now, might we begin to understand? Perhaps, but can it be okay if we don't? But at least that we have that space so that we can explore together. And sometimes what happens in the denial is that space is shut off. Much of what you talked about, is that it brings forth some sense of discomfort. There's some type of fear. There's something that's happening. And it's so unsettling, to where there's a need to just shut it off. And I really sit with how remembering him sitting right there in the center of that flag, it just really resonates with me, and perhaps a representation in my mind of the denial that, there's another that's there that we tend not to want to pay attention to, or not want to see, or not want to hear. Now, as you were talking about defense mechanisms, I'm shifting gears here, and so slow me down, Karen, if need be. I'm also thinking about intellectualization. And with intellectualization, yeah, it's evident, in the responses of the viewers who focused on the performance, and looking at the music, looking at the choreography, there was this attempt to try and understand it and group it in this certain way and intellectualize it. And because that couldn't happen, that the emotional and the political content was just so difficult to just sit with what he was bringing forth. It did make it it made it really hard to where people just began to say, well, it must have meant this, it must have meant that. And so let's move on instead of let's slow it down and think about what did it mean to us? Can we be with this for a while? And I don't know how you thought about that or think about intellectualization as a defense as well. But my thoughts went there.
I totally agree with you. And what came to my mind as you were just speaking is the inability to listen
Uh-huh.
versus it's not about understanding, certainly not right out of the gate, but just
Yeah.
listen to the other side. And that reminded me of some experiences I've had with the Braver Angels. And this is a group who
Oh.
came together. Actually, Bill Doherty, who's been on my podcast a couple of times, or I've talked to him several times. And he brought this group together of blue state and red state people, and it's quite impressive to watch the process because there isn't any denigration of the other side. People agree that they're going to be respectful, whether they're a hardcore blue state or hardcore red state person. They're going to listen to the other person, to the other side. And it's so impressive. I mean, the leaders actually listen themselves and then they on a whiteboard or some kind of board, they talk about what one group thinks and what the other group thinks and feels. And when it all comes down to it, there are many shared beliefs when people listen. That's when they find out we're not so different after all. But you'd never know it by listening to the rhetoric of one side or the other. And I think the same thing applies here. If you didn't understand Kendrick Lamar's messages, then okay, you didn't understand it. Where the dividing line comes, I believe, are those who just push it aside and say, that's not what I want at a halftime show. It's not for me. I don't care. And people who might have thought, I don't understand this, but I'm going to try to understand it because it seems like there's something important. And just because I don't understand it now, that doesn't mean I couldn't come to understand it. So it's not answering your question directly, but hopefully I'm in the ballpark.
Well, as you were talking I'm sitting here like, okay, this is really important for us as analysts because, and especially Black analysts, I'm wondering how often, I experience where there is the denial of bringing in something that's uncomfortable because, I'm Black and my patient may be white. My patient may be of a different ethnicity, a different culture, but there's something about what they're holding that is so uncomfortable. And in that discomfort, the fear of exposing what it is, exploring what it is with me, because, there is an uncertainty of how I might perceive it. And then in looking also at the intellectualization, not wanting to listen, let's move on to something else and not really wanting to listen to what might be there and wondering about even my own countertransference and how often that gets woven into it. And can I be mindful of that And I think that's really important when there is a difference in the room, which it always is, to not allow our countertransference to run off with it, but to just sit with where it is, because oftentimes running off with something is identifying with what's being projected, which is let's dismiss this and go on to something else, which then leads me to another defense mechanism, which would be displacement. And how often that happens too, because let's just talk about something else. Dr. Felecia, let's just talk about this. Let's talk about that. But in thinking about the performance, that there was a shift. Sometimes people didn't want to talk about Kendrick's message that he was relaying to all of us. But we can talk about the game. We could talk about the officials. We could begin to talk about the quarterbacks and compare their stats. We could talk about what was happening in Philadelphia versus Kansas City. But we could talk about Taylor Swift and where she was and what's going to happen within her relationship with Kelsey and, all of these different things, but a way in which to displace, what we're experiencing onto something else, to put that focus there because of whatever it is we're experiencing is just a little bit too unsettling to explore. And how often that happens, and happens quite often when there is a racial difference, when there is a cultural difference, when there is some type of, religious or difference that we see with our own patients. And how do we begin to, stay with that? And as I mentioned earlier, have a space to where we can look at our differences in a more tolerable way.
Well, very good. Couldn't have said it better myself. In no way could I have. That's spot on. There's so
Well, I like the fact that we can share, with each other, and at this moment, here we are at this impasse. There's no left or right, no wrong, right or wrong, but we're in a place of agreement here. I think that when we do have spaces like what you and I have, Karen, we can talk about things that are really difficult for me as well as difficult for you. And I did mention projection. And I think that's often there. Not that it's here right now with us, but sometimes we do hold things with each other. And I think that happened with this performance with Kendrick, is that there was a lot being projected. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of I'm not sure. And how much of that got projected within our own communities, our own society. And when we are uncertain about what's happening and we're trying to rid ourselves of this fear and worry or whatever the case may be, anger, injustice, or injustice that we feel that we're holding, then all of a sudden it takes this form that we can't tolerate holding, and we want to get rid of it. We want to free ourselves from it. And I think that also happened where it just got thrown out there in hopes that somebody would catch it and the other would be freed.
Yeah. One of my things in life is to write about projection and projective identification. And there's a lot of ways that they're closely aligned, although they're not specifically the same thing. Books have been written about the differences, and I've even attempted to write about the differences myself in several books. But I think getting rid of is something you were talking about. And for one thing that happens, and I've talked to patients about this as a metaphor sometimes, and with projection and sometimes the identification comes in too. It's as if we project things from our lives, from our experiences with parents or with others onto a big screen and then a huge screen. So a big entertainment center screen, or back in the day, the outdoor movie screen. We project parts of ourselves, our lives onto this screen. And then we start to believe what's on the screen. And
Yeah.
it may have little to do with what's actually going on, but in order to get rid of it, it's over there, it's on that screen. And then I start believing. It's like believing in the reality of a movie one watches. A movie is either a social commentary or it's for entertainment, or it was supposed to be one or the other and didn't quite cut it, but it's telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that it's actually reality. And so that's what happens with this projection metaphor that I'm talking about. People project things and then they start to believe, oh, yeah, absolutely, when they're not really able to process what's going on within. So just picking up where you started.
Yeah, that's, I'm glad we're talking about this today because there were just so many projections from that performance. And I really believe that that was the purpose. The purpose was to, and my thought was to loosen up what was so nicely packed within ourselves and to loosen it up, so to speak, so we could begin to think together about what's really in front of us. What is it that we see every day, but we don't see? We don't want to look at, and it goes back to, what you mentioned with denial. What do we visibly deny? What do we cognitively deny? There's so many layers to denial. But he brought us to a place where we're talking about these things. And in such a time as this, where there are so many ways in which differences tend to be front and center, and on one level embraced and on another level not. So what a powerful message that perhaps, got too intellectualized, got too displaced, too rationalized, to where we couldn't just sit with it and allow ourselves to be collectively in thought.
Well, one thing that we do as analysts, we listen and we talk. And we encourage our patients to talk about what hurts, to talk about what's been buried for a long time. And in the process, we listen and talk. They listen and talk. And together, we both learn things. And that's what's so powerful. When defense mechanisms pop up, and they invariably do because we're human beings, it puts a pause in that listening and talking process. It's, I can't hear it. I don't want to talk about it. Or not even with that prelude, just changing the subject. If you say to somebody, well, tell me about that experience that you recall when you were 8 years old, if they had started to tell you something, and they say, no, I don't want to talk about that. What's really important is what happened with my wife or my husband. Well, yeah, those things might be important. But also, what about what happened when you were 8? That's obviously influencing you too.
Yeah, those early connections or lack thereof could be painful places for many people to go and explore, and really utilizing some type of mechanism to help protect themselves from that pain. But there's something about, and we know as analysts, we know theoretically that there's something about those earlier attachments that do take us to those places that you speak of, Karen.
Let's remember the song, Sam Cooke's song. Yes. As powerful and sad and as important as it is. We have a lot to struggle with, but we hope through this struggle, something good will emerge or something better will emerge. There's that hope. I have that hope. And it can be very difficult to have hope in these difficult times. But if we don't have hope, it's difficult to move forward.
That's right. That's right. The song is really powerful in the sense that he shares where he is in that moment, but he also brings forth a hope of where he'd like to be. And that, with time, and I'll stop there, but with time, and how do we begin to utilize our time? And we can utilize our time at some point in a very collaborative way of beginning to listen to each other.
And that's the key, listening and talking without just acting, without getting into a political discussion, which is a whole other ballgame, so to speak. Maybe it's a sport, but I hope our political leaders will listen and talk to people about what they care about.
That I do too. And I hope that we will allow ourselves as human beings to listen to each other. Not just to ourselves, but let's listen to each other.
Yeah.
Let's be with each other during these times, because change is very difficult, especially when there is new generations of things that come in. And we're talking about, one generation with Sam Cooke, but now we're looking at a new generation with Kendrick Lamar. And how all of this comes together, and can we, even as human beings, begin to listen to all of us? Can we be with each other? Can we adapt to what's new? And if it's safe and useful for us, but it does make it quite difficult when there is just a one system to where we must listen to this, and this is the only way.
Yeah. I like the way what comes to my mind, and maybe this is a good time to wrap our discussion up for today, because otherwise this will be a marathon. A marathon discussion, but I'm thinking about Samuel Jackson and how he kept popping up, reminding Lamar that he was to this, to that, because for some people, he was too much of this and that. But if people listen, if they listen to themselves, their family members, performers, then something new can come from that new way of listening.
I'm in agreement.
Okay, well, for now, we'll say goodbye, and we'll be back again very soon.
All right.